I'm a member of the board of the Gasperi Foundation, and on behalf of the foundation, I thank all of you for being here in this time not particularly proper for starting a discussion on defense issues immediately after lunch. But I'm sure that our speakers will be able to give a lot of interest to us, also for your question, and which will follow the presentation from our speakers. Well, we have selected the topic of the European Defence Community and NATO. As Foundation De Gasperi, we have started a specific activity since just a couple of years on this topic of global security and defense. We have organized seminars, conferences in Italy, particularly focused on EU, common defense, and relationship with NATO. The term European Defence Community goes back to the 50s. It was used by Alcide De Gasperi at the beginning of the European project. So we think there is a new, it's something to relaunch now. The foundation has also organized a project for NATO 70th anniversary celebration. The title is Freedom is Not Free. We have made an important exhibition in a huge event which was held in Italy in August. And the project was funded by NATO. And now we are going on with the project, which also has as core a website on geopolitics and defense, particularly dedicated to schools and students and teachers. And we have also been awarded by SIDAN and ESDA the European Award of Citizenship, Security and Defense. And it's a great pleasure for us to announce this prize that the Gasperi Foundation got just a few days ago. I think that we have several challenges in front of us regarding security, and what I ask the speakers to show from their point of view, of course each of them will cover a different point of view, is what we have put in the short program of this panel, particularly regarding the fact that stability and freedom are taken for granted by our societies. And that's not the case, because freedom and stability, prosperity must be an everyday issue for every one of us. So we have also an education for our citizens, and I think that one of the goals of a foundation like the Gasperi and all the think tanks, the Martin Center and so on, is exactly to disseminate in the young generation the consciousness of the importance of those topics. So, what is the future of EU security and defense policy? How the relationship between EU and NATO evolved over the years? What kind of ambitions can EU have in the medium and long term? Those are the main questions, not forgetting some troubles which NATO is experiencing, and not only NATO, with the last events in the Middle East, but I think that it will be one of the topics which should be discussed later. So, first of all, I give the floor to Ambassador Francesco Maria Taló. He's now has been appointed recently as a permanent representative of Italy at NATO. He has a long career as a diplomat. He was Consul General in New York, special envoy of the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs for Afghanistan and Pakistan, ambassador of Italy to the State of Israel, and those are just the most important roles he had. Thank you, Ambassador Taló, for accepting the role of kickoff speaker, which is always a challenge. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Well, it is indeed a challenge because, like you said, just after lunch, I have the role of a coffee, and being between the lunch and very important and much more prepared speakers. I try to do my best. Here, really, as someone who is a beginner in its role at NATO, but this is happening in a very important year, in the year of the 70th birthday. So we can say that upon once a time, 70 years ago, there was destroyed Europe. There was the strongest country ever had in the world, super strong America, and the need to do something for security in Europe. And then it was the start of an alliance which became an organization, which became NATO, and is still strong and relevant. And how does it fit with our discussion today, with the world which is quite changed, with a Europe which is stronger, with an enemy which doesn't exist anymore, at least in the form we used to have in the past? Well, I would like to remember a quite famous quote of the first Secretary General of NATO, Lord Ismay. He used to say that NATO exists in order to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. I think it's quite a good way to mirror, to photograph the situation 70 years ago. The situation of Europe under shock, still under shock because of the Nazi war, which had a great need to keep the Americans in because the memory of what happened between First and Second War with the retreat of the Americans from our continent led to a second war. And of course, the German threat, very clear, imminent, with continuous new examples of advance of the Soviet and communist presence in our continent. Situation is clearly very different, but one element is still valid. The Americans are in. And this is probably the secret of the longest period ever of peace in the European history. Never, in centuries, in millennia, it's really epochal, Europe enjoyed such a long time of peace. And, it's not a chance, never a military alliance had such a long life. Usually military alliances are for a few years, 1 or 2 decades, and that's all, because the goal of the alliance can be overpassed by history because of victory sometimes. Well, the Atlantic Alliance won the Cold War and continued. And now the end of Cold War, we can say it's almost 30 years. In a few days, we will celebrate the collapse of the Berlin Wall. This was the iconic moment, the emotional and incredible moment when we realized that without shooting, without firing any weapon, we won the war. So deterrence worked well. The Russians were kept out, actually went back. We freed half of Europe, which was under occupation of the communism, and we reunified not only Germany but Europe. It was an incredible success. It was the end of history? No. It was the end of NATO? No. We had 30 years more. Why? Well, because challenges continued. And I think also because the values which are the real glue of continuity are still the common element which is the real base of our alliance. And so we have been able to adapt, to change to the new situation, and in the same time to continue. So continuity and changement are probably the 2 key words. And now the challenges are quite different. And here is the aspect of European Union, of Europe. The base of all this was American sin. And yes, they stayed in. Also Germans down. This, after a few years, this was no more valid. The Germans entered in NATO after a few years. They entered in the UN. They went up. Actually, the Americans wanted them to be stronger and stronger because we need Germany. We need a strong Germany, which is a way to say we need a strong Europe. The Americans realized it. And end of the day, all the alliance was about a transatlantic bargain. A deal between America and the European allies where America was continuing to protect Europe instead of going back, of retiring from Europe as it happened after World War I. But the Europeans had to contribute. And this was the beginning of burden sharing, because the transatlantic bargain was already the beginning of the history of burden sharing, which is the issue of the day in NATO, but not only in NATO. Of course, we had up and down, so we have moments of easier relations with the American allies, and moments of more complicated discussions, but always burden sharing had been an issue because our bargain was with America at large, not only with the administration, but also with the Congress. And the Congress obviously was always very careful about burdens. In this sense, we really have to think about, A, the importance of having common values, because we are the same field, and not all the world is part of this field of liberal and democratic values. The Soviet Union doesn't exist, but authoritarian regimes are still at power, and there is the great threat of terrorism. So we have to face these challenges. We have to be united. How? The Gasperi was dreaming a European community of defense. Maybe it was too early, but it was important to have big dreams. President Perez wrote a book which was published shortly after his death, which was called No Room for Small Dreams. I think that this is really the way we have to think. No room for small dreams. We have to continue to dream, and the dreams have to be big. And in this sense, the idea of a European community of defense is important. And this is important for burden sharing. It's important to strengthen our alliance with America. The Americans, on the other hand, should understand this, should see our development in the field of defense as a positive contribution. And this is not easy. This is complicated by trade competition, which is normal, but we have to understand where the competition has to finish and where we have to work together. And it's complicated maybe thus by some perception of political competition, and this should not exist, because politically we are the same field. So what is important and what we are trying to do at NATO, where at the end of the day we are the same countries, at least 80 or 90%. The membership of NATO is in majority the same of the EU and the other way around. So what is important is to proceed with this European development of a stronger industry of defense, of a stronger capacity of Europe to be a protagonist also in this field, but on the other hand, avoid duplications, have a European defense which is complementary with the NATO already existing capacities. It is not impossible. It is possible because there is lot of room of complementarity. There are things which are done better by the European Union in the economic fields, in capacity building sometimes, in military mobility, which is a very important asset, where Europe has a strong experience and capacity in the field of infrastructures. On the other hand, when we speak about the industry of defense, of course, America has a strong experience, and NATO has very important standards to respect in order to have interoperability. But where I think it is important to work together and have a big dream together is about the 21st century challenges, which means the so-called disruptive technologies. Here we have also the Chinese challenge. We do not want to have new enemies. We do not want to have enemies. China is not an enemy, but certainly it's a new protagonist. NATO is not going toward China, but China is coming as a world protagonist, as a global protagonist, and NATO has to face global challenges. In this sense, we have to keep the leadership in the technological field. The West has always had the leadership in technologies. We have to continue to be leaders. And nowadays, probably neither America nor Europe can lead the competition alone. We have to be united. And if we think to the American capacity to react to the Sputnik moment, when the Russians, for more than a moment, were leading in the space competition, then the President Kennedy had a dream to be the first one to go to the moon, and this happened. Now we have to have a dream to be leaders in new technologies, in artificial intelligence, in all its applications. This means we have to make huge investments, and we can do only together. And this will be a practical way, and also an ideal way, to have burden sharing. We have to put over all our best resources in America and in Europe in areas where we can have direct results, also for our civil sector, for our educational activities, in our research centers, and then in our industry, and for the occupation of our workforce. This could be really a fundamental project which is uniting. But in order to do this, we have to remember once upon a time, 70 years ago, the moment where we had incredible challenges, but we felt we had the same values. And this is still valid. We have same values, and we can have a big dream. So I hope that this can somehow stimulate further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for recalling us our common values, and also for giving a very interesting perspective regarding industry of defense, commercial issues, because I think that what happens with the Americans now is that they are not very happy with the fact that Europe is going to try to find a common defense system, because they look at that from the commercial point of view, and they see the potential loss of business for the companies. I think that this is the reason why the businessman Mr. Trump is against our common defense system. Now I give the floor to Angelino Alfano. He's the president of the Gasperi Foundation. He has been a prominent Italian politician in the last 20 years, I should say. He has been Minister of Justice, Minister of Interiors, Foreign Minister for 10 years. And now he chairs the Fondazione De Gasperi. He is very, convinced De Gasperiano. And so I asked him to give the point of view of the foundation also, I think, from the historical point of view, but according also to his last engagement in the Italian government, which was foreign minister, also an international viewpoint. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Paolo, and thank you to all of you for your participation at this initiative of the Gasperi Foundation. And it's very important for me to underline the importance of this kind of discussion between us inside Martin Center, because I think that the fine-tuning of a political line about this very delicate issue is a main point in a strategy of a political party. And I think that now we have to highlight the crucial role of NATO in a very delicate moment like the moment that we are living. And thank you, Ambassador Taló, for your very visionary speech, because you gave us a sort of wide picture about the international political moment. I think that we have some key issues that are for us the crucial points to underline, to understand the current situation into the international scenario. The first one about, and the most important in my opinion, about the topic of our discussion, NATO, the most important is the southern flank of the alliance. I was born exactly in the district, in the province where Europe finish and Africa start, because I was born in the district which include Lampedusa Island. And I consider Lampedusa a sort of new, of course, in an ideal vision of the current world, a sort of new checkpoint Charlie, not between east and west of the world, but between south and north of the world. And so, coming from there, I consider that Mediterranean Sea is a sort of epicenter of global instability. I underlined a sort of issues, a sort of list that allowed us to consider Mediterranean the epicenter of global instability. And it's impressive to realize how many are the issues coming from Mediterranean Sea. So, the instability of Libya, the chains of terror, the recurrent crisis in Lebanon, the crisis of refugees, the tensions in Gulf area, the tensions and contrasts inside Islam world, the crux of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the uncertainties coming from the Iranian nuclear agreement after the US decision, and again the exodus, real exodus of sub-Saharan migrants in the direction of the north, and then the foreign fighters, and again the last event in the borders between Turkey and Syria. If you mention all these issues, you have the idea about the crisis of Mediterranean. So, of course, I intend, when I mention Mediterranean Sea, I intend a wider Mediterranean vision and perspective. And this is the crucial point, because it's too simple to say here, to tell you here, that the origin of NATO is in front of the challenge of the Soviets. And now, which is the situation? We have not a Cold War, but we have Cold War, cold, without L. Cold War, we have trade war, and we have inside the Cold War, the cyber war. And how is possible to combine a sort of a stable agreement with our historical brother, US, into these three wars? The three wars that I mentioned, Cold Wars, trade wars, and cyber wars, are to be combined. Otherwise, it's really difficult to stay allied. And so, we have a very, very sensitive situation about the trade war with the new approach of Mr. President of US in the relationship of EU and not only in the relationship or in the direction of China. And this issue, I think that will be the key issue for the future. Because in the absence of a Cold War, is really, really crucial to combine the alliance in military sectors, the alliance in artificial intelligence, the alliance in Cold War, the alliance so in cyber war, and the alliance in the trade war in a global scenario. And in the global scenario, we have a new protagonist that Ambassador Taló mentioned, which is China. Sometimes I give to myself a question about NATO. Do we have to stay, of course, to stay united into NATO, between us, into the constituency of NATO? Do we have the necessity to have a greater enemy than Russia? Because in the origin, the challenge came from Soviets, and the bloc that supported Soviets in the world was a giant, the bloc, against another giant, NATO. Now, the perception of many analysts is that Russia is insufficient to represent the external enemy, and the absence of a giant as a sort of kind of enemy is a sort of incentive to have division into the constituency of NATO. The absence of an external giant to face. And so, I think that for many analysts is very, very important to highlight the spatial position of China now. Not, of course, not as an enemy, but an incoming and more than an incoming protagonist. I consider that in the geopolitical vision, China has the most geopolitical, the most important geopolitical challenge without the use of military tools in the history of the humanity. I use 4 pillars to describe you my vision. The first one is the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative is not just an infrastructural initiative. It's the way to connect countries, many, many countries, through an infrastructural initiative. And so, when you connect countries through contracts, economic links, the stability of this connection is very, very long-standing. The second pillar is that in the first time of the history, China as the perception of itself, of himself, like an navy power in terms of military force, navy power. Never in the history China considered itself like a navy power. Third, their presence, Chinese presence in Africa, consider that they have a military base in Djibouti port, in Djibouti harbor. And fourth, artificial intelligence. These four pillars are past the way to candidate China as the new protagonist. And so, if you combine the economic weakness of Russia, the increasing power of China, and the threat coming from Mediterranean Sea in a wider Mediterranean perspective, you have probably the new mission of NATO. Because as a sort of matryoshka, NATO and the issues, the problems of NATO include some other problems. If you consider that more than 90% of the constituency of NATO is the European constituency, you have clear the consequences of the division inside the constituency of NATO in general between Europeans and Americans, the consequences into the relationship in foreign policy between EU and US. And so the situation inside NATO is crucial in the foreign policy of European Union. And in the perspective of European Union, coming back to the first point, we have to combine the military alliance, the alliance in the perspective of a common increasing of our perspective about artificial intelligence, and in cyber war with the alliance from US with the trade war and new tariff barriers. Just to remember you, when we had to decide which was the best way to start our process of integration as EU, we didn't start from European Parliament that arrived in 1979, but we started unifying coal and steel. And so the trade reasons paved the way for the stability of the relationship and the stability of peace and to create the base for prosperity. In this interconnected and interlinked world, is really difficult without a NATO point of unification and unity to have a good relationship with EU, between EU and US. And the last point, about European Common Defense System. I had the privilege to sign with my pen the last and, in my opinion, most important agreement between us, between the Europeans, in terms of common European defense system in 2017, PESCO, the PESCO agreement. As foreign minister, I signed the agreement. And at the time, I consider myself very, very lucky politician, because I was and I am president, chairman of the Gasperi Foundation, and the Gasperi died in 1954 with the thorn in the heart about the failure of the European common defense as a pillar of a global strategy of the integration process. And now the history given to Europe another occasion to remedy to the mistake that we made at the time, and we have to seize this occasion. because it's strategic for us to don't repeat this mistake. Thank you so much.
Thank you, President Alfano, for recalling us the importance of the southern flank, which opens also the door to another discussion. What is the responsibility of Europe towards Africa and development of Africa? Because this is, my opinion, must be a priority for the next European Parliament and Commission. And also your clear vision about China, which is not an enemy, but for sure a competitor or a new protagonist. In front of those issues, I ask a question: what are the responsibilities of Europe in front of these challenges? And I would like to make this question to Stephen Blockmans, which will cover the topic from the point of view of Europe. Stephen Blockmans is a senior research fellow at the Center for European Policy Studies, professor of EU External Relations and Law and Governance at the University of Amsterdam, author of several books. I thank him for accepting our invitation, and I give him the floor, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and congratulations with the prize to the Gasperi Foundation. Indeed, I want to shift the attention a little bit from the strategic thinking which you've exposed, and which I think also encompasses the European Union's own role with NATO in this changing world, and focus a little bit more on the nuts and bolts of European defence cooperation and integration. We're far way off from de Gasperi's idea of a European defence community, and in fact it's been relabeled as many other unions in the European Union integration process, EMU, Energy Union, Digital Union, as a European Defence Union, with the ambition of materializing this basically in the next 4 or 5 years. And so I take it this is quite an informed audience. I will not lecture you on the panoply of different aspects which have been developed in the last 3 years since the presentation of the EU Global Strategy, but I would simply just like to recall them in shorthand. We now have capability development plans issued by the member states, CDPs. We have a methodology under a semester-like system in the defense sector called CARD, Coordinated Annual Review on Defense, which has been tried and tested. We have the first funding from the EU general budget come online under the predecessor of what will become the European Defence Fund under the next MFF. And we have 34, and soon more than that in November, when a third batch comes online, we have 34 PESCO projects, which have been developed by 25 member states, which are rather inclusive, at least those off the shelf, some of which have been drawn from the shelf of NATO in the first batch, and slightly more ambitious and more exclusive, with especially France stepping up its role in PESCO in the second batch of projects. And it will be interesting to see when that third batch comes online next month, whether that trend continues into a more ambitious type of definition of more strategic projects. I would like to focus my remarks basically on what's next. And I think there are 3 challenges that the European Union in the next 5 years, certainly the newly composed institutions, communitarian in nature, European Commission and the European Parliament, will have to address. And I think the first challenge is really that of output, concrete projects, which is a challenge in the hands of the member states, but where, of course, the institutions can push with their funding. But I think the litmus test for the new incumbents at EU level will really be to have something sailing, flying in the next 3-4 years. I know that it's early days now, and then it takes a long time, sometimes decades, to develop capabilities. But it should be possible at least to brand PESCO as a sort of success in the next 5 years, to have those concrete projects develop operational capabilities. So I think that's the first test. The second test is certainly that of coherence. I give you a flavor of the alphabet soup, in which we're all trying to swim in the European defence field now. It will be crucial to make sure that each of those mechanisms really interlock into the national defence planning processes of the member states. But the question then is, to what goal? What objectives, common objectives, should be set by the European Union? And in fact, this is an ongoing discussion in the Council at the moment around the rather fluffy concept of strategic autonomy. In fact, it's been labeled in different forms. It's been named strategic sovereignty. Mogherini, in her final round of speeches, seems to adopt the idea of cooperative autonomy. So the name of the concept is still in flux and perhaps sensitive, but not the content. The content is quite clearly defined in the sense that this is a relative concept. It's not a binary choice between having autonomy or not having it. It's really rather a spectrum reflecting favorable and unfavorable dependencies of the European Union as a collective. And what is needed is, within the European Union is what was mentioned in the opening remarks by the ambassador, a more mature approach to burden sharing between the Europeans, where the EU as an international organization can take up a more appropriate level of strategic autonomy in security and defense, without being accused by NATO members of challenging the transatlantic link when it chooses to do so. Now, to be sure, at this moment in time, the EU is not able, I would argue, to move towards this higher level of autonomy in security and defense just yet, but it is displaying a greater responsibility in these fields, and it is hedging against strategic uncertainties. As I mentioned, the concept as such, the name of the concept may still be a matter of discussion. The content is really not. It's clear that member states have a single set of forces, and that there should be no decoupling or delinking from NATO in this respect. And there is resonance, of course, with Madeleine Albright's famous 3Ds in that respect. No decoupling, no discrimination, and what was the no duplication of NATO assets in this respect. The basis for the basic goal, which had been developed 20 years ago by the member states at Helsinki, the Helsinki headline goal, is still not feasible in operational terms. The EU collectively cannot launch a sort of battle group of 60,000 staff within 60 days in a radius of 4,200 kilometers. Though that was the initial conception as an objective for the European Union, and it's my claim that it is key for the EU to develop that and to be able to have the capabilities to reach that goal in the next 5 years. Otherwise, I think the whole project of European defence integration will be in trouble. Third key element, I think, of work in the next 5 years is to secure third country participation, which is, of course, again, a link to the European, to NATO. It's a discussion, again, which is ongoing in the Council, and where we expect a Council decision or a regulation to be adopted fairly soon. The US, as been noted, is paying attention to the developments in the European defence sector that are happening, especially in the European Defence Fund. If they take it seriously, then something must be going right at the European defence level. We have Brexit, of course, the spectre of which haunts the same discussion about third country participation. And in fact, the EDF itself and the constituent document enshrined in EU law has been declared EEA relevant, which means that Norway, for example, which pays into the general budget of the EU, can benefit from access to the single market and thereby also the European Defence Fund. So there is already a sort of passerelle towards other NATO members. There has been a firmly conditioned access for EDF funding construed for NATO members, where they can add value and where this is in the interest of the European Union as a whole. But the question about participation in PESCO projects and the access to EDF funding for third countries rests on a discussion, a resolution of a discussion around, property rights, frankly, and EU classified information. PESCO projects, being EU projects, fall under the secrecy rules of the European Union. So the key issues to resolve here is that there will be no blockage rights for those third countries participating in PESCO projects benefiting from EDF, which requires a resolution on export control restrictions under the US ITR. And the added value element, which certainly the US and British companies could provide to make sure that the supply chains which exist are not disrupted and add value to the objectives set out for PESCO. But apart from an invitation by a PESCO project lead, it requires the unanimity of the Council to decide on such third country participation. So these three issues, the fact that PESCO will really develop capabilities which are operational in the next 3-5 years, which are key for its branding, the coherence with the other aspects of the defense architecture which has been built up and which is more or less complete and which will need to be implemented is key under a strategic objective which still needs to be agreed to or re-agreed to by the European Union. And third country participation are, I think, the imminent challenges for the next Commission, especially in the next 5 years. If resolved in the next 5 years, then I think there is hope that indeed we are witnessing a game-changing progress in a European integration process which is otherwise dogged by member state differences and divisions in other domains. But I'll be careful, to inflate the type of rhetoric which the spin doctors around Mogherini and others, use at this time to whip up expectations that the EU might not be able to meet if the three conditions that I sketched out are not met.
Thank you for giving us a very clear view from the EU side, let's say. Now, the last speaker, but not least, of course, is Kristine Berzina. She's Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund in Brussels. She focuses on EU relations with the US, and NATO, and so on. I know that you lived in Russia for a couple of years, and you are also original from Latvia. So I think that you can give us an overview of what happens on the eastern flank, particularly regarding how the hybrid conflicts are changing the priorities and the ways we have to face the new situation. President Alfano was mentioning the cyber war. Cyber war is one of the aspects of the hybrid warfare. So please tell us your point of view from this side.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be here today. And President Alfano, you started off your remarks with a big emphasis on the southern flank. And I think all of the issues that you've laid out on the southern flank are absolutely valid and of critical importance to Europe. But I think we are not done in the east, and we're not going to be done in the east at any time soon. So this is the starting point, both in traditional security terms and also in all of the new 21st century security terms and hybrid risks. When we end on the economic weakness of Russia, I think isn't an immediate reason to discount the reasons to be concerned about it, but in fact the vulnerability that creates and the sense of urgency for different outlets in Moscow could actually increase the security risks and the innovation that we see from that side. But it's important for Europe, therefore, to have tools in place to be able to counter the range of southern, traditional Eastern, and new security risks today. So it's important for Europe to expand its understanding of security and defense beyond tanks and missiles and boots on the ground, but to look more at the other range of threats that will make us vulnerable across all of Europe in our homes, in our traditional security structures. We've seen Europe and NATO both expand work on hybrid risks and countering hybrid threats, in particular on cybersecurity and disinformation. And this is also the most important area for cooperation between the EU and NATO. So we've talked about the EDF and other traditional means, but I'll talk a little bit more about what we have seen thus far on cooperation between the two institutions on these less traditional areas. So in PESCO already, we've seen an emphasis on new threats as well. Lithuania is leading a cyber rapid response team. The Czech Republic is focusing on electronic warfare. The Netherlands is focused on military mobility, which is also using some of these softer elements. These are all incredibly important things. But if we look at what Europe is doing in countering some of the hybrid risks, we have to look outside of just the EDF and look at, for example, a lot of the new initiatives held at the External Action Service. So here we are looking at, the Rapid Alert System, the EU Hybrid Fusion Cells, the Stratcom task forces, and even increased capabilities within ENISA. Since April, the EU Cybersecurity Act has given more powers there to Europe to counter cyber threats. So we've seen a growth in Europe's ambitions and Europe's capabilities in security and defense, not only through the increases of funding for EDF, but to create structures, coordinating functions, and political will to take on a lot of the new threats moving forward. We won't know exactly what will happen with a lot of these things in the new commission until we have a commissioner in charge of the defense portfolio, which is something that has not been brought up yet here today. But if we looked at the mission letter from President von der Leyen to Sylvie Goulard, then we see a lot of the emphasis that Europe will put on these defense structures. In Goulard's portfolio, digital technologies were a part of it, as well as traditional defense structures, and both of them are relevant for security and for defense in Europe. There is a call to contribute to work on enhancing Europe's technological sovereignty, to work on blockchain, high-performance computing, algorithms, data sharing, to have a coordinated European approach on artificial intelligence, to have a real single market for cybersecurity, in addition to all of the PESCO projects, in addition to military mobility, in addition to open and competitive European defense equipment markets. And I think all of that has to be part of our conception about what we mean for security defense. And the fact that we are seeing an interest in this moving forward is very encouraging. What I think is more of a question for Europe's political ambitions here is the fact that all of these things are put under the internal market and put under the French commissioner in this particular case, as opposed to stand alone. Yes, there'd be a new Directorate General for Defense Industry and Space, but really what kind of high political role are we seeing for these structures? Stephen Blockmans mentioned the question of goals and structures that are necessary for European defense. Well, there's this question of who leads. And who leads it within the Commission? Is it a portfolio that is important enough to have someone designated in charge of it who really will focus on this and nothing else? That, I think, is less clear. And I think when we see the proliferation of threats that Europe is facing and the range of tools that are necessary to counter it, we need guidance under the new Commission on how that who is going to lead that, what tools are being used, and what kind of approaches will be necessary across the EU to do this. Once there is clarity of that matter, it will be easier, I think, to have a transatlantic conversation. Because again, there's a question of what are you talking about? Like, what is European defense? What are you aiming to achieve? It'll be good to have words we can all use to describe what it is, perhaps words that don't inflame tensions from the get-go. But I think having clarity on, well, then who do you talk to and what will be their task for the next 5 years is going to be very important. If Europe is able to have greater clarity in terms of roles, officials in charge on this, the financing, which is coming to back this up, I think I'm encouraged about the prospect for better EU-NATO cooperation on this. NATO, since 2016, for NATO, the cyber realm is a domain of operations. There is a lot more emphasis put on cyber. There is an emphasis on hybrid threats, on new technologies. There's a lot of interest in this, but NATO by itself cannot take this on. It's not really within your scope, and so what is important is for NATO to be able to work closely with Europe and the EU structures on this, which is why the EU needs to be so strong in setting all of this up under the new Commission with the tools that will become available. I think the groundwork for that is already there. When you look at the fact that of the initial batch of cooperation areas under the Joint Declaration of Cooperation between the EU and NATO, 20 of the 74 were in hybrid. I think there's groundwork, therefore, to build on and to build out the cooperation. But again, as in just plain European defense, we have to see progress and deliverables in these areas. And I think that in addition to that, we need to see a lot of political buy-in from leadership in the EU and in NATO in making this happen together. And again, we need someone in charge of it on the European side before we can get there. But then once we have that, we need someone in charge on the NATO side who's really going to drive EU-NATO cooperation to get forward on these issues. Because staff-to-staff level cooperation is excellent, and that kind of awareness is very important. And the freedom for officials to travel across town, again, all of this is tremendously important. But if there's not sufficient signaling in the highest structures on both sides of town that cooperation on this is important, that there is enough buy-in from the Americans, from non-members on both sides to make sure that this continues, in particular in new tech, then it's not going to go anywhere. So again, we need new structures and new people on the EU side, and then the political buy-in when that happens on the NATO side, and continual re-energization of these efforts to make sure that we have greater cooperation on these new threats. When we look forward on other things that I am a bit concerned about for European defense to continue, are we giving enough attention to the new things, to new technological dependencies, to China, to economic coercion, to things that we haven't traditionally touched in the economic realm that will affect our security? And are we going to see sufficient EU and NATO cooperation on these issues, which are sensitive both within NATO and within the EU? I'm curious to see the signals for that. I'm concerned about additionality, duplication, just within the EU side. In particular, so the same year as PESCO, we have France launching its European Intervention Initiative. What does that mean in conjunction with PESCO? Because some projects are duly labeled. What does it mean in additionality, as separate from? If the Americans are to understand what Europe is doing on defense, having yet another structure and yet another series of acronyms to deal with is not very helpful. So I'm interested in seeing how the French initiatives are going to fit within the European initiatives, and how yet that again fits into a broader transatlantic security structure. And again, simply who's going to be in charge of these things on this side of the Atlantic, and once we have a person in charge, how is that individual going to pull together EU defense ministers and the member state capacities in a formal structure in Brussels? Because until we have a venue for all of the defense ministers to regularly sit together to talk about these issues, do we have anything that's real?
Thank you. Thank you for sharing also some real concerns we should have regarding the perspective of the new Commission and the new Parliament. Well, now we have 20 minutes for question and answers. Is not such a long time. The speakers were very interesting in their speeches, but a bit longer than foreseen. But we can forgive them for that, because they have given us a real broad overview of the topic. So now we have, I imagine, okay, one, please, 2, 3. Can you raise up? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we have 4 questions.
Thanks very much. I'm Roland Freudenstein, Policy Director of the Martin Center, and I have a very simple question to whomever it may concern. Can NATO survive a second Trump term? Now, we know that this, in the eyes of many, may have become less likely, a second Trump term, I mean, may have become less likely over the last couple of days, but one should never say never. So what I'm referring to here is we've heard beautiful declarations that really go right to my heart about common value basis. Is that value basis still there with the White House at the moment? And is it enough to emphasize that we still have this common value basis? Whatever the White House says, we still have it with Congress, with the states, with the checks and balances in the United States. So what is the possible development in the US going to have as an effect on transatlantic relations? Thank you.
Thank you, very good questions. I would collect the 3 questions, and then the second one is there, and the third one is...
Yeah, my question is continued with this mister, and if NATO survival in the second term of Trump, the NATO how to design the strategic the strategy with dialogue with China, since Chinese is not a threat to the NATO and the EU.
Can you identify yourself?
Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Peiran Wang. I'm Chinese. Chinese is coming.
Okay. Third question here. Okay.
Thank you, Gergely Varga from Budapest Institute of Foreign Affairs and Trade. My question would be on the Commission's future role. Of course, it's important to have a greater leadership in terms of EDF and how or what the EU will be doing in terms of defense capabilities developments. But my question would be, will the member states allow it in terms of the institutional delicate balance between the Commission and, of course, CSDP? By and large, it's still intergovernmental member states driven. And my second question would be, is there a time, or would there be a time in the next 4 or 5 years for a European White Book exercise? Thank you.
So, okay, now I give the floor to the speakers. So, can NATO survive? What strategy about China, and what perspective for Europe, White Book or something like that? Who wants to take the floor? There are no volunteers from this side. Ambassador.
Well, NATO. You mentioned the word NATO. I feel obliged to.
Sorry, I ask flash response because we have a lot of other questions.
Well, NATO will survive. Yes. Well, exactly because we mentioned values. I mean, administrations can stay, can change. It happened in many Europeans and Americans terms. And what is important is, for instance, how the Congress welcomed the Secretary General of NATO just a few months ago. I think it was a very important signal. We are working very well daily with the Americans. So, of course, it's a community of democracies. I mean, you have to accept that other countries change their governments and have governments with different ideas. So we are not 100% on the same page, but we have the same values. We go toward the same direction. So I have no doubt about this. This is not thought, of course, unity is the fundamental aspect. So we have to stay united, and in this sense, what is important is this transatlantic bargain. How dealing with the new challenges? I think that China is a challenge, like we said, is not absolutely not an enemy, not a threat. It's part of the new world system. Is out of NATO area of responsibility. In this sense, Europe is different. So in some areas, NATO is stronger. In other, the EU is stronger because the EU has world and global ambitions. It doesn't have any geographical limit in its action. And here somehow maybe we can link to the third thing. Europe can do a lot, and it's interesting that you mentioned a lot activities of the Commission. Up to now, maybe we focus too much on the activities with the intergovernmental side, with the external service. The Commission can do a lot, like you mentioned cyber, the Cybersecurity Act, hybrid. This is a field where we can do much more.
Stephen? Yes, well, picking up on the last question, I think it should be an ambition, at least, for the European Commission to come up with a white book of sorts. I mean, there's a lot which is already existing, which need, where loopholes need to be plugged. The procurement, for example, the 2 directives from 2009 allow member states, to use exceptionalism as still the way forward. Arms export control, again, a discussion in the crosshairs now with Turkey, which may create a problem, I realize, in NATO context, if member states indeed go in that direction of coordinating and harmonizing their rules even more. Cybersecurity Act was mentioned. So will member states allow it? Step by step. That has been, the functional integration method, la méthode Monet, which has been used and very successfully so in the early days of the European integration process. And I think this is how also the single market of defense will, gradually evolve.
Thank you. President Alfano?
I'd like to highlight that when we say that the southern flank is crucial now, is to reaffirm the idea about the relationship between NATO and the European common defense, because our task as Europeans is to pay attention to the southern flank, and this is the point of a complementarity between NATO and the European common defense system, because we have to be clear. Is crucial for us to represent a sort of engine in the positioning of the alliance in the Mediterranean Sea. Because when the alliance and NATO allow to others to fill the empty, we will have less role in Mediterranean. And having a less role in the Mediterranean Sea is a way to be less present in the global scenario. I consider that exactly in the global scenario, Mediterranean Sea is crucial. And if you are absent there, you are more or less than in the past in the global and geopolitical relationship.
Thank you. Kristine?
Roland, I mean, you labeled all of the enduring partners that NATO has across the United States, and I think that the long-term relationships are important. And NATO is a rapidly evolving body, and I think that the last few years have already shown the way that NATO is able to take on new thematic new thematic challenges and also modify its own structures to deal with internal pressures. And so I believe in the resilience of organizations and creativity to deal with a lot of the challenges that we see. Will the member states allow changes? That's something that I am interested in. I'm interested in particular, the role of France as an engine for driving a lot of European capabilities forward, or as a braking or slowing force in which particular situation. If we saw coherence on that, I think it would help all of our security and defense needs. But again, we are seeing mixed signals across the board, and a strategic dialogue with China, whether in whichever structures that may be. My sense is that in particular under the German EU presidency, we're going to be seeing a big focus on China. So in a year from now, and in that, and ongoingly, there are ways of trying to understand the European relationship with China and efforts to create a common stance where possible.
Thank you. Now we have more questions. We have time for 4 more questions. I take all of them in one round. Regarding China, I think that in a few years we will have another elephant in the room, which will be India, but that's another story. So, please. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Maurizio Geri, I'm from Italy. I work here in NATO HQ. I focus on the southern region. I call it region more than flank because we have, besides deterrence and defense, crisis management and cooperative security as pillars of NATO. So my question to the President Alfano and the others is, what could be the space where EU and NATO could collaborate more? Because we have Mediterranean dialogue, we have Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, we have many issues, as you, President, mentioned, in the West Asia region, besides in all continent. I think it's a moment in which NATO and EU could collaborate more in particular with the crisis on the human security sector, cooperative security sector, and crisis management. Thanks.
Thank you. There. Short questions, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Mohammed Rajai Barakat. I wanted to ask the same question as Roland, but you didn't answer this question. How can EU be with good relations with Mr. Trump, knowing that you said that we have the same values, but I don't think that USA and EU have the same values. When you see that Trump encourage Brexit, encourage some other new countries so as to leave European Union, when you see that he's making war, commercial war against EU, and many other things, how can we trust Mr. Trump? And he always also making war. We don't want military cooperation. You spoke about China. China is not a friend. When I see some videos about the power of China, you have to go to YouTube and see the military force and statistics about China. The Chinese role in Africa, I think it's more dangerous for EU than Russia. And the last thing is about our commercial, the threat coming from the Mediterranean. What's the role of NATO in this threat? Europeans followed USA and NATO to Libya, to Iraq, to all these countries, even in Syria. And the threats are coming from there, but who is responsible also about these threats? Thank you.
The lady there.
Thank you, and I thank all the panelists. I'm Olga Cosmidou, and I would like to ask Mr. Taló. He mentioned unity. He mentioned common values. There is a member of NATO which is not a member of the EU, and I'm not referring to the United States, neither to Canada, obviously not to Norway. A member state which is invading right now Syria, and most of European countries are against. Where is the unity there? The same member state is threatening another member state of the European Union. And the Secretary General of NATO keeps same distances. Where is the credibility of NATO? Where is unity and where is credibility? Nowadays, when we have populists who pin up this kind of situation, having this langue de bois when you are responding to real threats, I'm afraid it doesn't help unity, neither understanding, neither good relationships. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question. There was a last one? No. Okay. So, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Federico Taviero from the Martin Center. Very shortly, it's not directly on defense, but I think it's related to defense. And it's the development of earlier this year when Italy was the first and only G7 country to sign a memorandum of understanding with China about the country's participation to the Belt and Road Initiative. I think it was President Alfano's successor as foreign minister who signed that agreement. So how do you assess the country's considerations in coming to the conclusion that it was good to sign that agreement? Do you think it was the right decision? And how is it going to affect the position of Italy in the alliance, in NATO and more broadly?
Okay, so last tour, who starts? Would you like to start? We go in the
As you wish, yeah. I'll take up the question of Turkey. I agree
we have 7 minutes total.
I know. We should end the langue de bois. I fully agree. This is not an issue of NATO only. I leave it to the ambassador to respond to that. It's also an issue for the EU. When I see the conclusions of the Foreign Affairs Council, I weep. I mean, Turkey is supposedly still a key partner. Quietly, the term key strategic partner has been dropped. Frankly, this is a strategic rival. If you look at drilling activities in the EEZ of Cyprus, if you look at the invasion of Syria, if you look at the accession process, which is basically just petrified and dead and should be buried, to my view, I agree with you that a sharper definition of how we see Turkey, just as we've done for China, where we call it a systemic rival, is going to clarify a lot in our own mind and hopefully lead to more foreign policy results.
Kristine?
Sorry, on one point. I don't mean to suggest that Turkey is a systemic rival. This is not the type of military and economic power that is able to wield its, to throw around its weight to create a chain of vassal states, as China is doing along the Belt and Road. But to my mind, a strategic rival on many issues that Europeans, whether it's energy, whether it's migration, whether it's security, etc., are fundamentally disagreeing with Erdogan's Turkey.
On returning to questions of NATO's resilience, I think NATO is able to evolve quickly again, and it is able to address new threats with remarkable aptitude. So I think that it is going to be able to weather things also in the future.
I fully agree with you, Kristine. NATO has demonstrated to a strong capacity of adaptation in the past. President?
Thank you, Paolo. Two brief tweet, 140 characters. First one, let's look, for example, at about the cooperation between NATO and with EU on the southern flank. Let's look, for example, at the Hub for South NATO operating in Naples. Having identified the great capital of southern Europe and southern Italy was a strategic choice by the Atlantic Alliance, which has therefore acquired the awareness of the need of an even more visible bridge in the Mediterranean. And the second tweet is about China. I think that in foreign policy we have to follow all the highest principles, but also the principle of reality. And we have to admit that, yes, Italy signed an agreement with China, memorandum of understanding, but the other G7 countries has all good business with China. All the other countries in G7 constituency, and so to be sincere, is not an exception that Italy has some relationship with China.
Thank you. The last 4 minutes to
Yes.
Ambassador Taló to close our session.
Yeah, well, some NATO countries, which are not EU countries, can have different opinions with other partners. It's completely normal. It's not a monolithic alliance. We are not 100% agree. In our countries, we are not 100% agree. Our governments change, and from one government to the other, one can have huge changes. Values doesn't mean to be 100% on the same line. You can have a very strong opposition, which is democratic, and think that the government is very, very bad, is terrible, is ugly. This is normal. So values is something somehow higher, and it pertains on part of doing everything every day. We are very frank with partners. We don't agree. It's happening now with Turkey. The other partners are speaking in a very frank way to Turkey. On the other hand, Turkey is a valuable and very important member of NATO. And it's not a contradiction. And the Secretary General is doing his job as Secretary General. It's the Secretary General of all, including Turkey. He is not one against the other. He cannot speak against any member of NATO. It's not his job. It's different from the Secretary General of the UN. So this is very important to remember. And speaking about possible areas of cooperation between NATO and the EU, for instance, in human security, it's interesting you mentioned human security. I'm thinking, speaking about the Mediterranean, for instance, an aspect which has an impact also on our security, which is environment. So let's think about the security impact on environment and the environment impact on security. And so when we speak to this latter aspect, for instance, climate change, which can have an impact on migrations, is important. I think that in NATO we should, and we are actually more and more dealing with environment. The EU, of course, is much more advanced in this field. It's an area where we can work together. The other one, of course, is maritime security. NATO, of course, is a maritime power. The sea is more and more important on this point of view. This is also linked to the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, which, of course, is something important, is a challenge, is an opportunity. Let's take the opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you to the speakers. If I may add just a few words from my side regarding Turkey. I've been president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and I can assure you that the relationship with Turkey has never been easy. You remember the times of the conflicts between Turkey and the Netherlands, Turkey and Germany, and so on. I was president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, but I can tell you that the Turkish parliamentarians and Turkish people, I'm not speaking about the actual Turkish leadership, are strongly democratic people and are willing to look at the good relationship with the Western countries as well. So I'm confident that after a transition, we will be able, as NATO and as European Union, to find again good relationship with Turkey. I hope so, of course. So thank you to the speakers. Thank you for your presence here and for your questions.